This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Sharifa Gokadous.
Thousands of events are being held worldwide to mark the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day. A handful of European countries first marked the day in 1911 following a declaration by the Socialist Party of America. The United Nations has recognized March 8th as International Women's Day since 1975. International Women's Day celebrates ordinary women who have played an extraordinary role in the history of their countries and communities. It's also a time to reflect on the progress made for women's rights and to call for change. And it's a time to call attention to a number of issues facing women, including discriminatory laws, the high rate of pregnancy-related deaths, and the disproportionately high number of women killed and victimized by wars.
Here in the United States, the focus includes the Republican-led campaign against women's reproductive rights, the comparatively heavier burden of poverty on women, high domestic violence and maternal mortality rates, and the disparity between men and women in available employment and wages. Joining here in New York is Kavita Ramdas. She served as president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women from 1996 to 2010, currently senior advisor at the fund and visiting scholar at Stanford University. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Kavita Ramdas. On this 100th anniversary of International Women's Day, would you share with us the history?
Yes, well, I was sharing with a friend yesterday who said, oh, do you know it's International Women's Day? And I said, yes, and do you know that we should be standing in solidarity with the workers in Wisconsin? And she said, what do the two have to do with each other? And I said, everything. And you mentioned that the Socialist Party of America was the first organization to really call for a celebration of a National Women's Day, which was then adopted by the Socialist International. I think the connection between women's rights and workers' rights has always been a very key part of this, a recognition of women's productive contributions to society, not just their reproductive contributions to society. And I think that that's one of the arenas in which certainly those of us who grew up in the rest of the world grew up sort of marching and celebrating International Women's Day with a view to this joint goal of having women be full and equal participants in all aspects of their society.
And the labor movement has been tied in with International Women's Day. Talk about that connection.
Well, I think, you know, as you mentioned, in 1911, the Socialist International adopted International Women's Day, celebrated it in February, but in March of that year, the very tragic fire that happened right here in New York City that killed 140 primarily women workers, most of them immigrants, Italian, Jewish immigrants from different parts of the world. Ever since then, and actually, again, as I said, around the world, it has been tied to a recognition that these were women who were fighting for their rights as workers as well as women. And I thought of that when I was in Pakistan this January, meeting with home-based workers in their homes in Karachi and Peshawar. As a young woman, I think barely 20 years old, said to me, I said, how do you find the courage to continue to go out into these big marches? They had just held a march for over 600 women in the streets of Karachi. I said, you know, when you're restrained in so many ways from being able to be public. And she said, because women's rights are workers' rights, and we are workers. And I think that that's a tradition that the United States doesn't necessarily like to celebrate, much as in the same way I think you don't celebrate May Day with the rest of the workers around the world. You have your own Labor Day in September. But I think it is important to recognize that at a moment when the world has heard a lot about investing in women, we also have to remember that these progressive movements for women's rights were not in isolation. They were really very much seen as something contextualized in the context of larger struggles for justice.
Kavita Ramdas, you mentioned this is the 100th anniversary also of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and there are a lot of preparations being made for that anniversary on March 25th.
Yeah. I think there's also some wonderful work being done. I just saw the New York Times story of the reporter who actually found and tracked down the names of some of the women who had died, who nobody actually knew who they were. I think there is a need for us, I think, at this moment, particularly as there's an effort to marginalize the rights of workers, as you see across many of the states, particularly Wisconsin, Indiana, an attempt to kind of roll back some of the achievements that workers have fought for so hard. You see that happening simultaneously, Amy, as you mentioned, with the attempt to sort of roll back women's rights. And this is happening exactly at the moment that globally the voice is, oh, you know, the way to have development and democracy is to invest in women. So on the one hand, you have what's right for the rest of the world. On the other hand, you actually have a situation in which people are losing rights in the context of the country where those rights were fought for, you know, to begin with.
Can you talk about the issue of reproductive rights here at home? In Congress right now, while the Republicans are talking about jobs, 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 that is the main thing we have to deal with, behind the scenes in the various hearings, it seems to be largely about reproductive rights and the issue of large government being attacked. But when it comes to government intervention in women's lives and health care, there is a equally large push by the Republicans to call for large government.
Yeah, it's one of those very interesting contradictions that I find quite amazing, that the same party that's calling for a reduction of government in almost every sphere of our lives in the United States seems to have no problem intervening in the lives of women's bedrooms and in the, you know, in the very private decisions that are made about a woman's sexuality and a woman's body. I was at a Planned Parenthood event just last week in Menlo Park in California, you know, very privileged community. It could not be publicized. People did not know where the meeting was. There were canine patrols, there were undercover officers all across the venue because it had received threats from people who really believe that Planned Parenthood is not what it is, which is namely one of the primary providers of health care in the state of California and in many other states, but really you know, conflating the work of Planned Parenthood with a very narrow understanding of one aspect of their work, which is providing contraception and access to legal abortion. So I think we are really facing, Amy, as you said, a real challenge in terms of being able to hold on to even the rights that I think we've held for granted. And I fear that there is an invasion of the church back into arenas that I think we'd fought so hard for in terms of the separation of church and state. That's something you see women fighting for in the rest of the world, and here actually I think we're losing ground.
The White House recently put out a report on women in America. It's being described as the first status report on women since 1963. What does the report reveal about women's rights here in America?
Well, it's interesting in many ways. I mean, you know, if you look at the sort of headlines, I think you'd see absolutely unquestionable advancement. There's a lot of talk about the fact that women are now the majority of who's in higher education. There's a lot of conversation about the fact that women have made significant gains in terms of their leadership positions. And certainly we see that in you know, lots of different fields, not just at the State Department where Hillary Clinton heads the State Department, but in many other aspects of even in the private sector. Just go a little bit below the surface, however, and I think you have a very different set of realities that I certainly ran into just, again, 2 weeks ago. I was in Alabama, the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, speaking to young women there, listening to the ways in which they have been essentially taught in the Baptist church, where most of them sort of grow up, that it is women who are to blame for violence against women. And when I said, well, what does that mean? They said, well, pastors teach us that it is our behavior that incites men to violence, and therefore we have to be careful to cover up the 3 Bs, breasts, belly, and buttocks. We must cover up. We must not incite men to think impure thoughts. They even cited to me dorms where girls' dorms close at 10:30 and boys' dorms are open until midnight, because the belief is that if you keep girls away, boys can't get into trouble. I say that because I think it's easier for us in the United States to look outward and to talk about those poor women in those other parts of the world that we are going to save, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan, or, you know, you pick the place.
It's interesting in light of the radicalization of Islam hearings that are about to take place in Congress.
I know, and I found it actually very strange. I bet if you would put those Baptist pastors in the same room with the imams of Wahhabi Islam, they'd find that they have a great deal more in common with each other than they do, differences. So I think we do have a situation in which there is steady erosion of this separation of church and state, and it's actually a separation that people in this country take for granted. But I think what's much more disturbing to me about the right wing is not that they want to, fight taxes, or that they want to, roll back specific rights like the rights on reproductive health, but that there is actually this argument that is being made, and it's being made in a very cogent and cohesive way, that in fact this is a Christian country, and that in fact the values of Christianity should and must infuse all aspects of the Constitution and all